Dear friends, Monday, June 19th, Juneteenth, marks the 158th anniversary of General Gordon Granger's declaration in Galveston that, quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights," unquote. His announcement came, of course, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Then, and ever since, the message, let alone the reality of liberty and equality, has traveled far too slowly across this land. As our nation continues to grapple with its legacy of systemic racism, thrown into sharp relief again today with the Justice Department's report on the Minneapolis Police Department, Temple Emanu-El has chosen to designate the Shabbat closest to Juneteenth as an annual part of our ritual year. We marked our first Juneteenth Shabbat 2 years ago. The joint efforts of our clergy, our Stryker Center Director, Dr. Gadi Levy, and our Vice President of Finance and the Minister of Worship and Liturgy at Bronx's Goodwill Baptist Church, the Reverend Stephen Jones, who joins us on the Bema tonight and will deliver our benediction later. In 2021, Gerald Walker was our first speaker. Last year, Thomas Chatterton Williams joined us. Each addressed the importance of the day, not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans. Tonight, we welcome an individual whose interest in and study of Judaism can help us understand Juneteenth's special meaning for Jewish Americans. Certainly, it is a day that resonates deeply with our own history and traditions, and a reminder that with the many tasks still before us to advance the cause of justice, we must not depart this sanctuary tonight into a summer of moral slumber. Temple Emanu-El is so honored by and thankful for Senator Booker's presence. To introduce him, I'm deeply grateful to call upon our wonderful congregant, Peter Webb. Born in the Midwest and raised in the Southwest, Peter currently resides with his spouse in New York City. Peter is a small business advocate, civic leader, volunteer, and third-generation Republican. He was appointed by Manhattan Borough President Scott Stringer and New York City Council member Rosie Mendez to Manhattan Community Board 5. He's also active with various nonprofit organizations and sits on the board of directors of UJA Federation of New York and the YM and YWHA of Washington Heights and Inwood. In addition, he is a nationally recognized human rights campaign volunteer and former board member. He has spearheaded initiatives building bridges with national Latino civic organizations, HBCU leaders, elected officials, and faith communities. At Temple Emanu-El, he is an active member of the Tikkun Olam Committee and the Interfaith Dialogue Program. And Peter was recently accepted as a participant in the first ever New York Jews of Color cohort of the Wexner Heritage Program, the Wexner Foundation's Jewish Learning and Leadership Development Initiative for Jewish leaders throughout North America. His efforts on behalf of the Jewish and wider communities bring great pride to our congregation. Please join me in welcoming Peter Webb.
Thank you, Rabbi Davidson. I'm honored to call you my rabbi and friend. Shabbat Shalom and happy Juneteenth. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing a man who's no stranger to standing on a bema. Cory Booker began learning Judaism when he became friendly with an Orthodox rabbi in England, where he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He went on to become co-president of the L'Chaim Society, the Jewish student group. When he moved to Yale Law School, he co-founded another Jewish student group. Since then, he has officiated at Jewish weddings, rarely misses Seder, and frequently quotes Jewish texts and prayers. When he delivered the commencement address at Yale's 2013 graduating class, he offered a Devar Torah, and at CNN's town hall during his 2020 run for presidency, he offered a civics lesson about American ideals by quoting, in Hebrew, a high holiday prayer. During more than 30 years of public service, Senator Booker has lived both his Christian and Jewish values. As mayor of Newark, New Jersey, he not only fought for war against crime by expanding affordable housing, funding new summer youth programs, and increasing police force by personally patrolling the city's streets until late into the evening. He voluntarily took a pay cut, even while raising salaries for many city workers. And when a resident asked him on Twitter to send someone to her elderly father's house to shovel the driveway, Booker himself appeared at the man's door. Tzedakah and Hesed, justice and kindness, were watchwords in his office. Elected to the Senate in 2013, he has pushed for bipartisan criminal justice reform, been a leader in the fight to protect the Affordable Care Act, and introduced legislation to boost teacher compensation and increase enrollment of underrepresented students in advancement courses. He's also the author of baby bonds legislation to fight intergenerational poverty and the racial wealth gap by providing every American seed money at birth. Tonight, he brings those same shared values to our Bima. Please join me in welcoming Senator Cory Booker.
Good evening. Good evening. I grew up in a Black Baptist church. I'm used to the call and response. So let's try this one more time. Good Shabbos. Yes, now I feel at home. Well, the truth is, as was the incredibly generous introduction I just got, I feel very much at home. I was so humbled and excited to be invited to this historic shul to share some words with you all about Juneteenth. Now, you have to understand, I don't just respect Judaism, I love Judaism. I love Judaism because I have seen Jewish values evident in my entire life story. I have seen it in my history. I had parents that told me firsthand the Jewish leaders and servants that enabled my family to get into the middle class. I love when I see people who understand one of my simple values is before you tell me about your religion, first show it to me in how you treat other people. And so yes, the song during the high holidays that I love to call out, Ki beiti beit tefillah l'chocho amin, may my house be a house of prayer for many nations. That is the Jewish way. The ideals of radical mercy when God threatened to destroy the Jewish people worshiping a golden calf. What audacity, what chutzpah for Moses to look at God and say, Ma cheni na mi sifreka. If you destroy these people, then erase me from your book. The spirit of Joseph welcome strangers because we were strangers in a strange land. These are not just slogans. They're not just scripture to read. They are principles and ideals to live. And that's what excites me about being here today on this special gathering to talk about Juneteenth. Before I came here, I wanted to understand more of the tradition of this great synagogue, and there I read Dr. Samuel Adler, who was the second rabbi of this historic temple, Emanu-El. He talked about the Civil War at a time that there were many differing opinions, and he said, I consider the combat that is going on now after the outbreak of the Civil War not a failure of the Constitution, but an opportunity to fashion a grand transformation of this nation, to purge this nation of its greatest sin, to discover the root of our national malady, slavery, and having found it, tear it from our body. In crushing this unholy rebellion, he said Jews shared in the responsibility to advocate the internal, immutable principles of liberty and the inalienable rights of men. I stand here with a sense of joy. I stand here with a sense of gratitude. That in many ways, this journey within this country of this original sin before its founding, back to the 1600s, slavery was in our land, in our soil, driving our economy. Indeed, the cotton exports, or the value of cotton in the 1860s, was greater than the value of the slaves that were picking cotton was greater than the value of all the industry in the Northeast. It is a slave labor that is such a part of the story of America, and it's ending. All of those years that brought about its ending, one man didn't free the slaves. It's abolitionists, black and white, coming together, resisting the injustice, building the greatest infrastructure project this nation has ever known, the Underground Railroad. It was people that stood strong and demanded justice, people who fought for freedom, people who pushed this nation inch by inch further to its highest ideals. Now, it's fascinating to me, this incredible history we have is not well known. Some of the facts bear reminding. We know about the Emancipation Proclamation, September 22nd, 1862. It didn't come into effect until January 1st, 1863. Now, Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 19th, 1865, as the great rabbi has said, and the word did not get out for a while. 2 years from the Emancipation Proclamation, 2 months from Lee's surrender to Texas on June 19th, 1865. But even then, all the slaves in America weren't free. The Union slave states like Delaware, I remind the Delaware senators of this all the time, states like Delaware and Kentucky didn't free slaves until the 13th Amendment passed at the end of the year, December 6th, 1865. And that ushered in a period that we know as Reconstruction. It was also a period that was still marred by violence and conflict. It was a period that eventually fell in some of the shameful chapters of our history. And then one of the greatest periods of domestic terrorism ever in America began, where many of the massacres are not known in our history. People seem to be just discovering what happened in Oklahoma with the bombing of a town. People don't know and remember the race massacres we saw from Cincinnati to Louisiana. History is so important. The history of this nation is so critical to know. Behold, dor vador. Behold, dor vador. Some of you know the Hebrew because the Jewish faith knows the importance of remembering. I cannot tell you how many dozens and dozens and dozens of Seder tables I have sat at. Some of them, do they have to be that long? Some of them very long. In which this ideal all generations, every generation tell the story, but it's deeper than that. One must look upon themselves as if they had personally gone out. This idea, not just to know the history, but live it, project yourself into it. This is a very Jewish understanding of the value of history. We know this from the prayers. In the Shema, there is this reference to the history of Exodus. In the Midah that we just did, the 18 prayers, again, back to the Exodus in Egypt. In Kiddush, back to the references over and over of history is not forgetting history. This is something we see in our own American tradition. People calling upon us to know our history. Great Maya Angelou said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced, if remembered with courage, it need not be lived again. Our history is not just something to know, it's something to internalize because of those two things it gives us. It gives us that larger need for empathy. Now, some of you are still perplexed by my introduction of how does this guy, this Baptist from Jersey, this senator, know so much about Judaism? And it was referenced in my introduction that I was I think the only ever in the history of humanity big black goy head of a Chabad organization. I think I am the only one. Somebody fact check that. But it all happened when I stumbled into this Chabad house on a Friday night thinking I was meeting a woman who stood me up. It's a whole nother speech. And I met a rabbi. It happened to be Simchas Torah. And I'll never forget wanting to get out of there immediately. But this very frum-looking woman asks me to sit down after I find out that the woman wasn't there. And before you know it, I'm engaged with the rabbi in deep conversation. By the end of the night, I'm dancing around with the Torah until he tells me if I drop it, they might have to fast. And even though I never fumbled at Stanford, I hand it off really quickly. I went home that night, woke up the next morning, had lunch with some friends who told me, oh my God, those are Chabad folks, they're right-wing radicals and all these things. And it didn't sit right with what I felt in that room, the spirit and the welcoming of me, the stranger. And so I went back to the rabbi and I said, hey, rabbi, I've heard a lot of things. Can we have a conversation? He engaged me in conversation and immediately I realized we didn't agree on everything. But as Alex Haley tells that story about Malcolm X on a commuter train here in New York, as everybody was nervous looking at Malcolm X, and finally a white man stands up and walks over to him and goes, Mr. X, I don't agree with everything you say, but I respect you and I like your style. Malcolm X was said by Alex Haley to stand up and get close to the man and then offer his hand and saying, you can search the world 2 times over, but you'll never find 2 people who agree on everything. The rabbi and I affirmed something that day, something about our histories. We both admitted that we knew some about the black experience or about the Jewish experience, but we knew fundamentally the call and command to love your neighbor, to love one another. Summarize the whole Torah, standing on one foot. And so we said, in order to know each other, let's learn, let's exchange books about each other's culture and faith and religion and history. And I'm embarrassed to say I was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, but the first book he gave me was one I had never read anything by this author. He gave me Night by Elie Wiesel. And I gave him something he had never read, but it was Malcolm X's autobiography. And we agreed that there was no pressure, but if you don't finish the book, that's okay. But if we finish, we'll do another exchange. And before you knew it, we were exchanging dozens of books. And it began my curiosity to begin to sit and learn Torah. But what was amazing for both of us, as we talked over the books we read, was this powerful connection between blacks and Jews in America. Whether it was the founding of the NAACP, blacks and Jews, whether it was the people speaking at the March on Washington, a black man who had a dream, and a Jewish man from Newark, New Jersey, Rabbi Yocham Prince, who told people that the greatest tragedy is not that there are people that are poor. The greatest, most shameful thing is silence. Blacks and Jews who did freedom rides side by side, blacks and Jews who died together as Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. And it aches me now, it hurts me now that at a time after George Floyd where I thought the expansion of consciousness, of understanding people like Maya Angelou more in this country that were willing to unflinchingly look at the wretchedness of our past, thinking that we were going to expand our understanding of who we are. I see a backlash on history. I see books being banned. I see educators being silenced. But we here in this historic temple, we know that history is vital if we are to look to the future. The Torah is rife with embarrassing moments. There's infidelity, betrayal. Imperfections of humanity are replete, but we tell the story over and over. Even in the Exodus, you see the frailties and the fears. But there's something about knowing your story. It's something about knowing history that expands empathy and gives strength. Those who want to take American history and whitewash it and homogenize it and Disneyify it are weakening the truth of our country. They are weakening the story of America. They are belittling the strength of who we are and what we have overcome together. Oh, yes, yes. It is soon to be Juneteenth. This is a day of jubilation. It is a day of joy. These celebrations started almost immediately after Juneteenth. The next year it started, they actually got together and bought land in Texas to celebrate on. In Houston, there's still an Emancipation Park because they wouldn't let them celebrate in parks because segregation was still the law of the land. But they called them Jubilees, year after year, Jubilees. Why? Well, you know, your Judaism. Shemitah, we just studied it about 4 portions ago. We did, didn't we? Okay, good. Every 7 years. But 7 times 7, every 49th year is the Jubilee year. Freedom of slaves, forgiveness of debts. It has a Jewish root, this word, Yoel. Jubilee. And here in this country, this tradition has gone on and on and on. And I am proud to be one of the senators who co-authored and was the original co-sponsor of the legislation that was sent to President Biden's desk. Me and 4 senators weren't sure if we were going to have resistance, weren't sure if there would be objections on the Senate floor, as there have been so often to so much important legislation. But this one passed with unanimous consent. And here we have an opportunity every year, like some of our great religious traditions, to tell the story, to learn more, to celebrate. But it's more than that. We are in difficult times. The story of America is continuing. It's not a linear one. There are strides forwards and strides back, but yet the commands of our common traditions demand that we continue the work of bending the arc of the moral universe. It doesn't bend on its own. Martin Luther King said, change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability. It must be carried in on the backs of foot soldiers of justice. That's what we are right now in our tradition, in our time, is foot soldiers of justice. And in a nation now where there are people afraid and worried, in a nation now where people are wondering if we will find a way through or over or under or around the blockages that are stopping our nation from claiming peace and strength, at a time that our nation now has more shelter-in-place drills in our schools than fire drills, where we give the implicit message to our children, we can't protect you, so we're going to teach you how to hide. In a nation that still leads the planet Earth's industrial nations, at the top of the list for child poverty, at the top of the list for maternal mortality, at the top of the list for infant mortality, at a time that we are still the nation that even when we passed the 13th Amendment, we put an exception for people in prison that they don't have freedom, and then established a system going back to the 1800s where state legislatures literally said, let's pass laws like black codes to strip African Americans of their voting rights, because if they vote, they can vote us out. And it began a period of mass incarceration that goes on till today, where there are some counties where upwards of 1 out of 4 African Americans can't vote because of criminal convictions, where we have more African Americans under criminal supervision today than all the slaves in 1860. And what do we do to people in prison, even as close as Rikers Island? We do what other countries call human rights violations. Shackling pregnant women who, when they're giving birth, putting children in solitary confinement. No, the story of freedom and liberation still demands. Our history speaks to us the sacrifices of those who came before, and now we have the obligation to not just face our history, but be empowered in the struggle by it. I don't understand people who say that reading the wrenching truth of history is weakening. The Fire Next Time, one of my favorite books, and one of them that I gave to that rabbi back in Oxford when I had this beautiful afro. It is a book that does not flinch in its description of the difficulties of the 1960s, the divisions, the bigotry, the hate. But at the end of that book, an incredible James Baldwin speaks to this idea of history and the obligations of those of us who really understand. He calls on the readers after all of this to still be hopeful, to still be agents of hope, to cure the ills of our country, to free people from fear and violence and discrimination. He calls for there to be a Jubilee, because the alternative to him is destruction. He says, I know what I am asking you is impossible, but in our time, as in every time, the impossible is the least we can demand, for one is, after all, emboldened by the spectacle of human history in general, and the American Negro history in particular, for it testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. And now if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we don't, now dare everything. The fulfillment of the prophecy recreated from the Bible in the song of a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time. This Juneteenth is not just a federal holiday. It is a calling to spend some time to review the history, to ask questions, to ignite your curiosity, to see the greatness in our past, especially of those who overcame impossible odds. It's a time to celebrate the joy and the freedom that we have, but then to turn to look to the work that is still to be done. It is to understand that this is not an African American holiday. It's not a holiday for black folks. This is a uniquely American holiday for all of us. It speaks to the traditions of blacks and Jews. It speaks to the tradition of the Japanese and the Chinese Americans. It speaks to the traditions of the Irish Americans who saw signs in this city, "No Irish need apply." It speaks to the truth of struggle. It speaks to the hope that we can heal, that we can find within each other redemption. So, in my quest to be a rabbi, I do have an honorary degree from Yeshiva University. My friends used to call me Jewish until some congressman here made that bad. But I want to end by talking to you about this week's Parsha. Shalach, to send. I loved it when I got up this week and knew that this was the Parsha and this was the chance I had to speak not just to the Parsha, but how it relates to Juneteenth. You all know the story. Moses and the people make it to the promised land, and 12 scouts are sent in, and 12 scouts come back, and 10 of them are terrified. They say that we look in the eyes of these giants. They are too big, they are too great, we can't overcome it. In fact, we look at ourselves and see us as if we're grasshoppers in their eyes, and they must look at us the same way. But there were two dissenters, Caleb and Joshua. They were stuck in the Dayenu moment. Wait a minute. It was enough that God brought us out of Egypt. It is enough He parted the Red Sea. Dear God, He gave us manna from heaven. We can do this. Look at our history and know that we should not be afraid. And that fearlessness is what I call to you now. In the words of a man named King, who also got to that Mount Nebo and also saw the promised land. He said in his last hours of life, in a speech in a city fighting for economic justice, his words concluded with these: well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I have been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go to the mountaintop. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I am not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And he went back to the Lorraine Motel. And he slept in that motel bedroom. And he got up the next morning, and on the balcony there, he was slain by an assassin's bullet. Go with me now to the Lorraine Motel. I was there recently, and the tour of the motel, it's now a museum, and when we got to that door, they pulled some keys out and said, "Senator, would you like to walk on the balcony?" And I walked onto the balcony. I had a friend with me. He fell to his knees when he looked over and saw what I did, a line in the pavement below the balcony from where the shooter was to the point that King was slain. And as I stood there on the balcony, feeling our history, feeling the pain, feeling the hurt from a generation before me, knowing that it wasn't just the blood of King, it was the blood of Medgar, it was the blood of Kennedy, it was the blood of freedom riders, the cracked head on the Edmund Pettus Bridge of John Lewis. I looked over the balcony, and to my surprise, there was a stone there with words etched into it from the Torah. The fathers and mothers of the community decided to mark that spot where a pastor died, where a black man died, with the words of the sacred text. And what did they call us to? The words do not evoke smoothing over history or disappearing it. The words evoke truth, painful, hard truths, from the Armenian genocide to the Truth and Reconciliation hearings in South Africa. It tells the truth, but it does not lose the vision. The words of Joseph's brothers, written on a stone below the balcony where King was killed. When they saw Joseph, these are the words there right now. "Behold, here cometh the dreamer. Let us slay him and see what becomes of his dream." Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans, my mishbucha, I tell you right now, what will become of the dream? It is our generation's turn to answer that question, and the only way we answer it is by telling the truth of who we are, of not shrinking from our history, but rising to it. What will become of the dream of a slave, the dream of a farm worker, the dream of a stranger coming into this strange land? What will become of the dream? The only way to answer that is from within. Each and every one of us must stand before God and say, "He ne ni, behold, here I am. I am a dreamer. I remember, and I commit myself that we as a people here in America will bring forth the land that has been promised of liberty and justice for all." Thank you.